And during these events, you have a possibility of asking questions and giving comments to politicians and other people, so you can share your thoughts on the EU in general. Let me give you a few figures. We are holding these discussions in many European cities and towns, and everybody who wants can participate after registering, and we've already had 91 citizens dialogue, so 7 dialogues with the Lithuanian commissioner, 11 dialogues with other commissioners, and a total of 79 dialogues with other representatives of various EU institutions. If you have a smartphone, you don't need to download any applications. You can enter sly.do in the search window, and you will see what you can do there. You can answer questions that we ask, and you can also enter your questions, which we are going to see on screens. So it is really simple. Please open that application and enter the hashtag kelias, which is road in Lithuanian. We'll be talking about transport and roads. That's why we've chosen this hashtag. And now I will introduce our guests, some of whom you know very well. So we have EU Commissioner responsible for health and safety, Mr. Vyteniu Andriukaitis, and the Executive Director of the European Railways Agencies, Josef Doppelbauer. So, to give you some information on what this agency does. So this agency raises the level of interoperability of the railway system, develops methodologies, and helps to create the single European railway area with a high level of safety. So if you have your phones in your hand, please answer the first question. So what is the word that you think of first when you hear the words the European Union? So please vote. We'll see how this system works, and you will also get a grip on how all this functions. Well, I can see that 15 people voted, so the first thing that comes into mind when you hear the words the European Union is freedom of movement. I believe that this is a very beautiful concept, and it will remain high on your list. You can also ask questions. And I have another question for you. So what is the main problem in the area of transport that has a negative impact on our health and welfare? So you can choose between pollution, traffic accidents, traffic jams, insufficient regulation, too much regulation. So the same briefly in English.
Excessive regulation of transport. 67%.
So 67% of you think that the main problem is pollution, then accidents.
We are in the Railway Museum, which has many exhibits that are not used anymore. Which elements of current infrastructures could you expect to be featured in this museum in, let's say, 50 years?
Well, as you have introduced, the task of our agency is to make the railway system in Europe interoperable. And we have one technology that we are promoting, which is called the European Rail Traffic Management System, which relies on radio to transmit the information to the driver. So the signals that you currently see along the track are no longer needed, so these signals will then be in the railway museums in 50 years.
Pone Andriukaiti, kaip jums atrodo?
Aš tik galėčiau.
Suprantu, kad ne jūsų sritis, bet...
Aš tik galėčiau pritarti.
Mr. Andriukaitis, what do you think? Well, I can only agree because I have to listen to the highest level expert here. Because this area is quite far removed from my area of competence. But as a historian, I can say that almost anything can find its way into the museum, even the fast trains. So which problem has the biggest negative impact on our health and welfare? So the majority of people have said pollution. Yes, pollution is our problem number one. Of course, we are talking about the entire transport sector. That is the road transport, railways, ships, and air sector. Well, you can think that aircraft flies somewhere high in the sky and doesn't impact on our environment, but they cause a lot of pollution. And we know that diesel fuel is a polluting fuel, kerosene too, and you know that road transport is responsible for the major part of pollution in cities. There are a lot of traffic jams. You can see lots of traffic jams in Brussels and elsewhere, and you will probably find it difficult to believe how pollution indicators change when people decide not to use cars. For example, Brussels has a car-free day, and we've made calculations that during that day, pollution goes down by 70%. So these figures are really impressive. In the context of climate change, I can say that the situation is very dramatic, but we don't discuss this problem enough, and the awareness of this problem in Lithuania is very low. So, well, you saw that the main concept that was mentioned in Slido was freedom of movement, and it is very important to Lithuanian people. They don't think about solidarity anymore. They mainly think about freedom of movement. A lot of people leave, a lot of people emigrate, and this is a reflection of a serious problem in our mentality. When it comes to pollution and railways, well, I found information which shows that 75% of freight is moved by roads. So this means that this transport emits 275 million tons CO2. So the EU policy is to move more freight to railways. So how are you going to achieve that?
Well, you are absolutely right that moving more transport from polluting transport modes, and this is road, but also aviation, as the Commissioner mentioned, is one way to attack the climate change problem. And if we compare, for instance, aviation and rail is more than a factor of 10 better, and the same or even stronger is true for automotive. Now, if we look at market share of rail freight, you gave a global figure, but in Lithuania we are in a situation where we are having a very high market share of rail freight already. So the market share in Lithuania is 65%, and the average in Europe is only 17%. Now, even if we look in Lithuania, you have a difference between east to west, where you have almost only rail, and north to south, where you have still road, which is the Via Baltica, which is not only a problem of pollution, but also a problem of safety. Now, the answer at European level to move more freight from road to rail is, of course, to eliminate the barriers, because the big issue now is And this is the difference between road and rail. In road, you have no national rules. So a driver from Ukraine can drive without borders from Ukraine to Portugal through Germany, France, Spain. If the same would be done on the rail, you already would be stopped on the border between Ukraine and Poland because of the different track gauge, and then you have different signaling system, different rules. So we fight by eliminating the national rules and by introducing the same technical systems. In Lithuania, of course, we need to invest in building new railway lines also for the north-south.
About what's topical in Lithuania, we have questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to read the first ones two out because they are interlinked, and this is one of the big topics we are going to discuss. Kodėl per beveik 30...
So why hasn't Lithuania integrated into the passenger railway system of Europe over the last 30 years? And the next question, when will we be able to go from Vilnius to Riga by railway? I believe that this question is related to the Rail Baltica project, which has been postponed many times. It is still being postponed. We've heard that the Lithuanian railways had to pay hefty fines, but the citizens are receiving the message that this project is stuck. So I believe that this question is addressed to you, Mr. Doppelbauer. So when will citizens feel that the project is being implemented?
Well, I admit that Rail Baltica has been a long and difficult story, and for me it is also an illustration of the advantages of being in the European Union. The problems of Rail Baltica have, in my view, to do with the silo thinking, so that all countries have their own objectives. But if we really want to make progress, we need to work together. So that's the European spirit. I believe now that we have a plan, a concrete plan for Rail Baltica, and unfortunately will still take until 2026. Before then, the trains will run and connect Vilnius and Riga. By then, the travel time will be 2 hours and 1 minute, so it will be significantly faster than today by rail, or even much faster than what you can do on the road. So the message is, we need to cooperate, we need to work together on a European level, and then we can also achieve these projects.
Pone Andriukaitį, girdim iš pono Doppelbauerio, kaip galima suprasti, kad
Mr. Andriukaitis, we can hear from Mr. Doppelbauer that every country is limited to its thinking related to its national interests only, and that's why the project stalls. Can you agree with that? Oh yes, in the Lithuanian fields you can still find silos, silo towers, and many our politicians do live in those silo towers, and because they have a very narrow place via which they can see the world. They see the world in a very limited way. And Francis Bacon was saying that people cavemen can watch at the world from the perspective of their caves. I have been a member of the Baltic Assembly and in the Baltic Council too, and I have had very bitter experience over there because we didn't realize that the Benelux countries or the Nordic Council countries have demonstrated a different logic. Only a few hundred kilometers away across the Baltic Sea, they have been able to develop many joint areas across the Baltic Baltic Sea. Let's have a look at the Benelux. Luxembourg is the biggest example of that. This is a small, minute country which is not fearing to lose its identity and disappear or to lose its language. They are not scared of these things. Some try to scare us that we will disappear. But this is just a myth. And Luxembourg is live and thriving, and Benelux is also alive. And we, for instance, were building the LNG terminal, and we did not agree on how and where it has to be constructed, including the underground gas storage. Why? Because this was related to profit and money, and everybody was interested only in their own interests. Why should we be thinking about the neighbors? I remember how we were building the beginnings of the Via Baltica project. We first of all constructed the customs posts, and then we had to dismantle them. This was the waste of money. This is thinking in silos, and this is as a type of mentality, the attitude towards the world according to Harp. And of course, there are so many economic interests involved, business interests, and so on. Who will be traveling from Riga to Moscow? You know that the major direction is from Riga to Moscow and from Moscow to Kazakhstan by railway. But then we are proposing another way, another direction of transporting freight, and that's why the interests collide. And the question is, when shall we be integrated? This is the question to everybody, to us, to the Parliament, to the Baltic Council, to the Baltic Assembly. Why have we been so inactive? Because we were only looking at our own interests. What have you done as a commissioner in order to avoid that? A lot, to tell the truth. My portfolio encompasses a very important element, food safety, and the African swine fever, which is in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland, and we even had a conflict between Poland and Lithuania. Where I told them that if you forget that we have the single trade market and the single market where the goods have to circulate freely, this will be a big disadvantage. When we have to protect food safety and comply with the requirements, we have to step over our national interests. Regarding the bees protection, we have banned 3 pesticides, while some still vote against these proposals because they need to protect the sugar beet producers, although the benefit generated by bees is much higher. What have I done in the area of food safety and health safety? I have been able to overcome those national mentality obstacles, and which actually do not help us. For instance, we had a similar situation in the beef market. I was saying that you are the ministers of the European Union, of the whole European Union, and you have to think in the same way together. You have mentioned Poland, and I will address this question to Mr. Doppelbauer. Are there any possibilities to affect the Polish railway to manage their Rail Baltica stretch as soon as possible?
Well, I believe Poland is just an extension of what I said before. We also need to make it very clear to Poland, and Poland up to the border of Lithuania already has the standard European gauge, but it is more about integrating the Rail Baltica into the wider Polish, but then also from Poland on to Germany, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. So we need to make sure to show to Poland, but also to potentially private operators, that there is indeed a business opportunity to connect their network, to connect it with the network of the Baltics, and to take profit of this. So I believe it is, and I understand also from Commissioner, in Europe it's always a mixture of giving the incentive, showing the advantages, but sometimes also imposing some pressure by making an appeal to the common European objectives, to the objectives of a strategic importance for Europe.
Ar auditorijoje yra
Are there any people among the audience who would like to raise any questions, not via the app, but directly, especially if this is the question related to the Rail Baltica project? If you have any such questions or comments, raise your hand, please.
du net klausimai, vienas.
We have two questions. Please.
I came here about 20 years ago, the first time, and I could buy a ticket from Kaunas to Munich in Germany. I bought the ticket at a ticket office in Kaunas. I was told the train times, the connections, where I had to change, and that was all possible 20 years ago. If I do the same now, my limit is Białystok, and then I'm on my own. And then from Białystok, I need to find out from the Polish railway company how to get any further. And then further out of Poland, another company, and so on. Okay, it's a little easier now. There's websites that can help me do a ticket all the way through. But the point is, we've gone from being quite well connected in Europe with trains to being disconnected totally. And with no end in sight to the idea of having passengers as a key part of the policy for development with lit rail. And that's a worry, because I think it'll be a knee-jerk reaction 2 years before 2026, where they will think we have to think now about passengers and what to do. So your comments?
Well, you have made a very important statement, and this is indeed a very big problem for the railway system in Europe. I took my office in 2015, and our agency is located in Valenciennes, which is in the very north of France, just across the border from Belgium. And the first thing that I noticed was I couldn't buy a through ticket from Valenciennes to Brussels on the internet. So I myself launched a campaign, and after 2 years I succeeded that we could buy a ticket on the internet from Valenciennes to Brussels, but not in the other direction. So from Brussels to Valenciennes, it's still not possible. So it's another example of the disadvantage the railway system has, because in aviation it's clear you can buy tickets to the whole world. You can even buy tickets involving several airlines. And in rail, unfortunately, this is not possible, or no longer possible, because it used to work better in the past. So we have the technological base for it, because part of the exchange of data is regulated by us. What is lacking is the will, and we are back to the same topic, unfortunately, the will of the railway companies to cooperate. And they are very keen that they don't let private operators in. In the hotels you have the example of Booking.com or Trivago, who make it very easy for the customer to book a hotel room, and one could imagine a similar platform for rail, but this is of course prevented also by the incumbents, because they are afraid of losing business. In my view, we also from the policy perspective need to impose much more pressure on the railway companies to open up that market.
So just to turn this into a little case study, why can't you make another campaign to make it possible for the trains to also go reverse direction?
No, we are continuing our campaign, of course, but it takes time before it sees results.
Aš tik tai paraginčiau.
I would only like to encourage you to do the following. Well, the European elections are coming. I know that there are colleagues who are planning to take part, so please do something. Please address this problem as soon as possible, because this will facilitate travel greatly. Well, for example, students taking part in the Erasmus program would be very happy to take a train from Vilnius to Portugal, for example. It is not necessary to travel by air or by bus. So, as far as I can understand, you are now campaigning for the future MEP who is starting his campaign too. Well, I think that we should start discussions, debates in Lithuania so that we can see that there are steps needed to facilitate rail travel and address the problem of climate change and pollution and many other things. Well, these are vital issues, but we are far from being aware. So I think that there is a need for broader political campaigns that would allow us to understand that the railway sector should be more integrated, more automated, and even the development of fast trains that would allow you to reach Brussels from Vilnius within a few hours would be a welcome thing. Well, I, for example, took a train from Shanghai to Beijing. I was traveling by a fast train that was produced by Europeans. The speed was 360, 377 kilometers per hour, so it took me 2.5 hours. Well, but I believe that there's one comment from our audience that many problems are due to shortages in infrastructure. Can you add something to this, or we can move to the next question?
Well, we clearly also have infrastructure bottlenecks in Europe, but again, infrastructure is one thing, connecting the countries is another thing. And on the infrastructure side, there is another very critical example. You know that in Switzerland we have the longest railway tunnel in the world, 56 kilometers. Was built with many, many billions of euros for constructing this tunnel. But both in Italy and in Germany, we have no railway lines to connect to this tunnel. So we need to build infrastructure, but we need to see this in the context of the overall situation. We need to see this in relation to connection. So where do I need to go from A to B, and where do I need to take a measure, be it in the organization, be it in the construction. So we need an integrated European policy. So we are back to the MEPs.
Well, I can see that there's someone in row 2 who has a question. Please introduce yourself. Yes, I'm Tomas Keršis. I represent the Lithuanian Railway Association. I have a question to Director Doppelbauer. Well, we talked about passengers, let's talk about freight. The Commission has recently approved the 6th Railway Monitoring Report, and Lithuania received a couple of negative comments. Lithuania has the highest railway infrastructure taxes in the EU, and it is also the only member state that has a closed market, that hasn't got a single private carrier, either in the passenger sector or freight sector. So what is your opinion about this? You are probably aware of the situation in Lithuania, and Lithuania has already received fines for competition, for breaking competition rules.
Well, I'm aware of the situation, and I also briefly discussed the situation this morning with the minister here in Vilnius. I, on the one hand, believe strongly in the virtue of competition, because competition globally improves the quality of service and reduces the price. At the same time, I'm also aware of the specific situation of Lithuania, where the majority of traffic on the rail, or rail freight in particular, goes in the direction east to west, including the corridor to Kaliningrad. So I'm also aware of the strategic consequences of opening the market without the proper policy. So one needs to carefully monitor the situation, and I close now the loop back to Rail Baltica. I believe when we are better connected here to the west and to Poland, and then also to the north, then we are in a different situation, and then I believe also competition will come automatically on these connections.
Kalbant ne apie krovinius, bet...
Well, if we speak about passengers, I know that Lithuania has some very bad statistics. A lot of people die when crossing railway tracks. So what hasn't been done in this area? What should be done in order to improve the statistics, in order to improve the situation?
Yeah, first of all, let me make a small correction. We are not talking rail passengers. We are talking, and officially we call it persons killed by trains in motion. We are talking people who should not be there, unauthorized persons. And this is indeed a big problem here in Lithuania. We discussed this again this morning also with the minister, and I have been in contact with the Lithuanian authorities since several years, and there is a campaign here. There are two measures. One measure is to build better level crossings that are technically protected, but we also need to work on the culture. We need to educate people, we need to tell people that train is dangerous, train has a very long braking distance, a train driver cannot react when the train driver sees you, so please be careful, please obey the rules, please do not trespass, please do not cross the railway line where it is not transmitted. This is related to behavior. We need to positively influence the behavior of people, but unfortunately behavior change always takes some time.
Would you say then that Lithuania is doing enough to overcome these issues and to implement these two measures that you just have mentioned?
Well, in regard to safety, it's very difficult to say one does enough, but I can only compare what Lithuania does to other countries, and here I have to really appreciate that in comparison to other countries, Lithuania really does a lot.
Kalbant apie...
Well, when it comes to those painful situations, painful cases where people die when crossing the tracks in the places where it's not allowed, well, in many cases these people are drunk. There's also a problem of young people who wear headphones, listen to music, and simply can't hear the approaching train. And there are cases where people want to show how brave they are. So they make selfies and are hit by trains. So there are people who want to show off, who drive through tracks, try to cross tracks in cars just before the train comes. So there are many situations, different situations which lead to deaths. And it is not only limited to railways. We have a lot of accidents on our roads. Well, we managed to improve our statistics slightly, but we've now hit a plateau, and the situation isn't changing anymore. So we should be thinking about more measures related to traffic safety. We should organize traffic safety campaigns and education campaigns. But it is, well, this problem is very particular to Lithuania. Lithuania is the first leads in Europe according to the number of early deaths on the roads and on railway tracks. So we should think about a program aimed at preventing those early deaths that are completely preventable, and these deaths have not anything to do with healthcare. Well, but regulation and control is important here. This is what our audience have told us. This is also an important problem. Yes, I do agree that there is insufficient regulation and control. I can tell you this from my experience. Another interesting aspect is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union that had a command system, we had this psychology: stop regulating everything, let us behave the way we want, and we'll regulate everything ourselves. But time has shown that this is not the case. So we need a balance between regulation, control, education, and investments into safe infrastructure. All these things are important. Does anyone else want to ask a question or give comments from the audience?
Pone Doppelbauer, kalbant apie
Mr. Doppelbauer, regarding the railway, insufficient regulation and control. People voting think so, 18% think so. What regulation is missing in order to solve the problem of people who get into accidents on the railway would decrease, so that the problem is eliminated?
Well, if we come to railway regulation, there is always two opinions. One opinion is that rail is over-regulated, and this is certainly true in comparison to other sectors. So rail is much more regulated than the automotive sector, and it is certainly true also at European level, because at European level we have two levels of regulation. We have the European regulation, but we also have the regulation in each member state. And unfortunately, the regulation in each member state is different, which leads to the problems with ticketing, which leads to the problems at the borders, which leads to the technical differences. Now, other parts are not completely regulated. And now coming back to safety, here we have pushed a very specific aspect which is called safety culture. And Lithuania is the perfect example for explaining that culture, because it is a cultural element, like Commissioner just explained, to show that one is a very courageous person, to also think that I have done this for 50 years, I know it is perfectly safe. So this is something that is in the culture, and we need to create a safety culture in rail. This is firstly based on the fact that we want to protect human lives. Secondly, also, when somebody makes a mistake, we need to make sure that we learn from the mistakes. So we need to be transparent, we need to report these incidents, and we should encourage that people report and not hide it. Now, safety culture is something that is important, something that is very strong, but unfortunately you cannot impose culture by regulation, because then we are back to what you mentioned, to the times before 1992, when the command structure was imposed. We cannot do this. So it is about information, it's about education, it's about leading by example. These are the measures that would help.
Transportas generuoja vieną.
Transport generates one of the largest share of the GDP. Lithuania is a transit country, and does Lithuania need transport engineering specialists? This might be one of the priority areas. I don't know whom the question is more suitable. Mr. Commissioner, what do you think? Well, the reply could be very easy. Yes. Yes, yes. Our engineering capacities are depleting, and if you observe what young people choose, you will notice how many managers we have, and we have fewer and fewer engineers in all areas. Let's have a look at our professional landscape. And we forget that we have to invest into our major values. Of course, we are a transit country, but we can have the transit in the railway sector, in the road sector. Of course, we have the transit in the air sector, but also electricity, oil and gas. And due to the fact that Ivan has closed the pipelines, the gas transit has rusted. The oil transit has rusted. We don't know what will happen with gas, and we are not sure what will happen with electricity. We don't know for what purpose we are going to use gas. And if the Belarusians could burn straw for their nuclear power plants, we would have a very good straw market, and the peasants would have the possibility to realize their production very well, and that would be in line with their values. Well, but Lithuania doesn't understand one thing. By the way, we have the transit of the waves, that is the transit of transfer of signals. So these are our national assets, which could generate the revenue to our national budget, which is very low. And moreover, we are trying to create obstacles to generate such revenues. The possible transit of oil, no matter from which country, Russia, Kazakhstan, or some other, would generate a lot of profit. For instance, if we could generate the profit from the transit of electricity or waves or oil or something else, and this would be national revenue. But we are too bureaucratic, and we do not prepare the necessary specialists for that. And of course, in that case, we would be selling straw to Belarus so that they burn straw in their power plants rather than gas. Of course, I am being ironical, but I do see a lot of loss in economic terms, social terms, in terms of progress, innovation, and so on, because each transit line requires digitalization, electronic issues, and other aspects, which involves a lot of progress. But we stick to a very limited thinking, believing that if we stick to the traditional methods, or we will win something. But we do have to understand what our national assets are, and that they can generate the revenues to the budget, and this would fund our educational, social, and health systems. I can give you a lot of statistical data, how much we have lost due to our ideology. We have a very strange term, and energy independence. And the biggest opportunity is to receive as cheap resources as possible from various areas and produce a product which we could export. But nowadays we import more than export. Welcome to reality. This is a very wide issue and requires many and serious national discussions. Well, we don't have a lot of time. That's why we need to concentrate on specific questions, which are very good. If there are people who want to raise the questions directly, please raise your hands and ask the questions directly, because the discussion will be more lively. And I see that we have one direct question.
Well, the freedom of movement is ensured not only when we have proper connections, when they function well, but also when the services are affordable. In other words, when prices are such that people can buy tickets, buy services. So you mentioned students. This is the group of people who wants to enjoy the freedom of movement. And this group also comprises families. Families are also very interested in the freedom of movement, especially by railways, because it is cheaper than traveling by air. So I have the following question. Does the EU transport policy foresee any possibilities or actions, or maybe something is already being done to enable us to ensure maximum affordability of services to families with children?
Well, perhaps I start first and then the Commissioner will complement. You are absolutely right that affordability of the railway system is a key issue. And we have this as even our mandate in the ground rules of our agencies, which is stated as make railways better for society, which also includes affordability. Now, for me, there are a couple of elements. First one is we need to take cost out of the railway system. And if you compare the cost of production between rail, low-cost airlines, and bus, you will conclude that the cost of production for rail are at least 100% too high. So they are a factor too much. We need to take out half of the cost. Part of the reason why rail is so expensive is, again, back to the silos. Commissioner brought the example of China. In China, you have 20,000 kilometers of high-speed line. You have 2,000 high-speed trains. You have one big country of more than 1.3 billion inhabitants. You have one system of rules. In Europe, we have 27 member states, and every member state have their own rules, their own technical requirements, and we have very small market. We have in Europe also high-speed trains. In France, we have TGV, and the biggest number of trains that are of the same type is about 100. So we have 100 in comparison to 2,000 in China. And if we compare this to aircraft, we have heard in the last days a lot about the Boeing 737. But Boeing 737, there have been 8,000. So it's much higher volume is lower cost. So the first element is make the single European railway area, make one big market, and reduce the cost. Second element is competition. Because when you introduce competition, you will have competition on the basis of service, and you will have competition on the basis of price. You see this in several countries already. Italy being a perfect example. In Italy you have competition between the state railway and the private railway company. Effect was quality going up, punctuality in Italy much better now than in Germany, and price going down. So, and these are also elements in the policy of the European Union. You heard the comment of the colleague from the Lithuanian Railway. The Commission is very strict now in supervising the competition rules, because we believe that competition can indeed increase the accessibility.
But what does that mean to a citizen? She, as a person, cannot really encourage competition in the country like Lithuania. What is there to do from the citizens' part?
Well, then I will come back to the statement made earlier by the Commissioner. You have the chance now in the European elections to support those MEP who also have an agenda that opens the market, creates competition and improves the accessibility.
Aš pratęsiu, jeigu galima, vieną.
I'm going to add something and mention one more aspect. The European Commission and the European Parliament has discussed the possibility of creating a European student card that would allow students to use trains, to travel by trains, and the cost, the price of that card would be covered from the European programs. Well, this is a possibility. We could also consider certain social segments and support to certain social segments. But this leads us to another important question. Can the EU support the construction of social housing for young families? Well, the former Commission President, Mr. Prodi, presented an impact assessment and calculations, and their answer is yes. Yes, it is possible to do, and we need more social investments, because the social climate in Europe after the economic and financial crisis has been worsening. We have about 140 million people living in poverty, so you can calculate how many Lithuanians we would have in this number. So, and how many young families cannot afford stable housing or cannot access social housing, and this problem is most acute in cities. We should be thinking about structural budget support. So we should decide whether social Europe should become issue number one on our political agenda, because currently the social dimension is in the third or the fourth place. Well, you can now hear a lot of ideas about social Europe. So it is a welcome thing that after 20 years we are starting to speak about social Europe. So those who will I would like to encourage those who will participate in the European elections. We have submitted our report on social Europe. We also mention pensioners, and we know that many people in Central and Eastern Europe who are now pensioners were 50-year-olds in 1990s, and they paid a very high price of transition. You can see that, for example, Scandinavian senior citizens are traveling all over Europe, and our pensioners are forced to stay at home. So what should we do about this social inequality. We should also think about our national budget and our budget support. Well, we subsidize our passengers from freight transport, through freight transport. Our colleagues from the railways can confirm that we would be forced to close certain routes if they were not subsidized. But we also need to think about increasing budget revenue, and we should be thinking about many social groups. Well, I would like to go back to the issue of transport and ask you about aviation. Well, but I believe that this question is universal and would be relevant to other transport modes too. Well, as you know, the European Commission and the EU institutions are very sensitive towards any state aid mechanisms in member states. For example, state aid provided to national air transport companies, national carriers, etc. And the response and the fines that are imposed are usually explained by the wish to maintain competition. But don't you think that this only encourages the participation of big players in the market? For example, well, Estonian Air went bankrupt and it was replaced by Scandinavian Airlines. So isn't it that while trying to protect the market from unfair competition, we simply promote big companies?
So, first of all, I believe, and also coming back to the previous question, that having an open and fair and transparent market is globally a good thing. I'm also personally not convinced that this necessarily leads to monopolies, because if we have and of course we need to be very careful that we have an equal playing field and that we have a true competition. Because if we just have monopolies and unfair conditions, then it will happen exactly as you said. If we, on the contrary, give open access, we support also startups, we encourage competition, then I believe we will not end up in a situation of monopoly. There will be concentration because normally economy of scale works, but at the same time there is always place for new entrants, there is always place for new startups. Think of Ryanair. They came out from very low and now they are one of the biggest airlines in Europe, and there are other positive examples. So globally, competition, market opening is a very high value, and I also fully understand why the European Commission is very strong on supervising the competition.
Ir aš tuomet pratęsčiau taip.
I would like to continue both yes and no. This is a very difficult situation worldwide. We were now discussing about the relationships between China and the EU. China allocates a lot of state aid or state subsidies to business and infrastructure, and they are very aggressive. And in this case, when we say that we are market economy countries which has anti-monopoly measures, on the other hand, China is very close. And they invest, they buy and monopolize, and they don't respect the World Trade Organization rules. So the question is, how can we protect our market? And what market entities in the EU can globally compete? And how can we encourage the integration and protect ourselves from the huge competition from China? And A few months ago, the questions of the UK used to be a routine question for us, but now we have more relevant questions like the difficult situations with the competition from China and the US. Let's take the dairy industry in Europe. If we cannot protect our dairy industry from the aggressive Chinese strategy, this will affect the air carriers, the railway carriers, and the whole system, because and also this is also related to the steel industry. Without steel, we will not have aviation, and you know that the Commission objected to the merger of Alstom and Siemens companies in order to create a concern, because their version was they wanted to develop a high-speed train. Yet both Alstom and Siemens globally cannot compete with China. This is absolutely obvious. On the other hand, we cannot make this decision directly because this is against our competition situation, competition laws. I don't know what will happen in the future, but globally, the EU may lose its industrial and production capacities if we do not realize that we have somehow to withstand the competition from China and other countries. I suggest that we go back to the specific questions related to transport rather than competition. We have little time left, and I will ask you to become more active. The questions will be soon displayed on the screen. To which area of transport the EU should allocate much more attention so that this contributes to economic well-being.
Railways, road, maritime, inland waters. And while people are answering this, let's ask this very, very simple question that was on the screen a while ago. Pone Andriukaiti, komisarė, jums klausimas. Toks labai paprastas, žemiškas.
This is a very simple question to Mr. Andriukaitis. When was the last time that in Lithuania you used public transport? Just recently. Sorry, we cannot hear it without the mic. It was just recently. I took a trolley bus together with my colleague. I think it was number 3. I think it was number 3. Did you enjoy it? Well, tomorrow I'm going to take the train to Kaunas. Tomorrow in the morning I'm taking the train to Kaunas. This is public transport too. Did you enjoy your experience of taking the trolley bus? Well, actually, it hasn't changed a lot since I used it last time. I don't use trolley buses very often. I used the older version, the older model of the trolley bus. Our fleet is not very modern, well, but things are as they are.
You're saying railways just because you are here? Probably not, but anyone else who would want to ask a question, shall we comment on this?
Aš vis tik norėčiau čia pakomentuoti.
I want to comment on this. If we speak about health and economic welfare, we first need to concentrate in Lithuania, and this is the message I want to pass on the fact that we have done too little in the area of road transport in order to reduce pollution, because we have made a decision to achieve a certain level of pollution reduction, and we have only achieved 4% of this objective, and the Commission has insisted on its position to Lithuania, which has the government of the Greens, and maybe they are not totally in line with ecological objectives. And in the area of road transport, we have many problems, and the pollution level in the cities is a huge problem, which means more allergies, more infections, and heart attacks, and so on. These are things related to the pollution in cities and health problems. Therefore, I hope that the Vilnius municipality authorities and the national authorities have to fulfill their obligations. There is a question from the audience, Jim McGeever.
Things just to ask questions. All right, so I like the question about asking the Commissioner about the use of transport. About 3 years ago, I went to Rotterdam for a 10T conference. Rotterdam is one of the best public transport systems in Europe, one of the best, if not the. And what happened for all the people from the Commission? They had a special spate of laid-on minibuses and taxis for all the officials from the Commission coming to the event to talk about sustainable transport. Okay, so sometimes it's great to hear what's being said, but quite often it doesn't transfer into practical reality. There's one point on the same, we've talked about poverty of energy, social poverty and so on. In Lithuania, you're right about having decisions not forced down because nothing gets done, fully agree. But the way to get things done would be to provide funding or money. That does work in Lithuania for sure. We've just spent about a 6-year period preparing sustainable urban mobility plans in Lithuanian cities, 18 of them. Okay, so they're about now to be implemented, if not already. For the next program funding, can we not have any mandatory sustainable energy carbon action plans forced upon cities or forced upon countries? Because this subsidiarity policy, it doesn't work, does it? Because we provide all the enthusiasm from the top, but as you say, when it comes down to the country level, they decide to do or not to do. And making it mandatory, it's not a problem. It helps them to plan, it provides them with funding, and it reduces the ability of people to die an early death. So is there any way of getting anything like that done on a mandatory level and providing the funding in the next program to support it?
What can I say about it? First of all, I like very much definition, high-level conferences. Gerai. Man patinka.
Well, I do like high-level conferences, listening to different declarations, signing them, and then seeing how they are signed by presidents and prime ministers, and then see how they are implemented in practice, and then see that there is a huge gap between high-level commitments and their practical implementation. You mentioned sustainability of transport and sustainable development goals. Well, we have undertaken to implement many sustainable development goals by 2030 in member states. So let us look where we are. I present European Commission's recommendations for Lithuania every year, and these recommendations often mention problems related to environmental taxes, pollutions. There are calls for moving towards sustainable transports. So this has been repeated 4 times, but the practical implementation remains poor. And the level of implementation is about 25% in all member states. But I don't think that this is only a problem of subsidiarity. the problem is that there is a huge gap between national governments that frequently change their ministers. For example, well, 2 or 3 ministers might change in 1 year, and it is very difficult to monitor their political will and their actions. And there is so there's a gap between governments and implementation. But we already started speaking about conditionality related to funding in the next multi-annual financial framework. If you have undertaken obligations and you are not implementing them, there will be a possibility to apply financial measures, financial sanctions, and this is a positive thing. Because we often see that the governments are pro-European only until they receive money, and then their pro-European orientation disappears. I have in mind Hungary here. So, yes, I can confirm that when it comes to the next multi-annual financial framework, we are discussing this and there are measures proposed. So, should those sustainable action plans be mandatory in the next MFF? Please state your opinion. Well, this is not up to the Commission to decide. The decision will be made by the Council. And let's be realistic. Well, if we introduce conditionality and certain financial leverages, that would be a positive thing because the level of implementation is poor. Well, when it comes to transport means, well, the speaker said that people who come to sustainable development conferences usually take individual cars and travel alone. Well, but this was my brief remark in order to give my colleague time to give the microphone to our next speaker. Hello, I represent Lithuanian Railways. I'm Gintras Baužys, Deputy CEO of the Lithuanian Railways. My question is addressed to Mr. Doppelbauer or to those Lithuanian representatives that will be elected to the new European Parliament. Well, you know that there are 3 main carriers: aviation, coach transport, and railways. And we are talking about promoting competition in these sectors, but these sectors are subject to different types of regulation. For example, when it comes to railways, well, railways is the most convenient means of transport for people with disabilities. But there are discussions now in order to remove certain limitations and restrictions in the area of railways. For example, removal of the force majeure and then other rules when it comes to transporting people with movement disabilities. For example, buses have a lot of limitations. But if we introduce new rules in the railways, this would increase the cost. We would need to modernize our entire fleet. So this will probably lead to higher costs and higher prices. But we are saying that we need to move people to railways and encourage them to give up their cars and give up travel by air. So what information do you have about these discussions? What are the plans? And is the Commission aware of the situation? And what is your opinion?
Perhaps again I do a specific answer first and then I let the Commissioner come back in more general terms. I have 2 answers to you. First answer is I am absolutely in favor that we need to have equal conditions for the transport modes, for aviation, buses and rail. Unfortunately, currently, rail is not in the most favorable position. So if we think of compensation for delays, the rules are much stricter for rail than they are for aviation. So first policy objective should be to harmonize these conditions. Second is that we, and in regard to passengers' reduced mobility, we are preparing the input for the technical specification on PRM. And of course, for every change that we do, we have to do a thorough impact assessment, because there is always, as you rightfully say, the two aspects. The one is to make rail more accessible, but the other aspect is the cost. And we very carefully evaluate what is the benefit and what is the cost. So we monitor the economic consequences very tightly.
Aš pradėsiu nuo to, kad aš nesu Europos parlamente.
Well, I will start by saying that I'm not in the European Parliament. I'm only in frequent contact with the European Parliament because I'm the European Commissioner, and my portfolio contains a lot of sensitive issues, that is food safety and health, and I am aware of the opinions of MEPs. They are usually very active before the European elections, and they often propose things that are very far removed from science and from calculations. Well, it has been said correctly that in every case you need an impact assessment to determine costs. Well, I'm not sure how the new parliament will behave, but I know that immediately after elections, the new parliament is usually very rational, very sensible, because they know that the next elections are far away. And only during the last year they start proposing unrealistic and weird things. So the parliament is elected, it starts working, and then we'll be asking about the impact assessment, because the parliament has a possibility of carrying out an impact assessment. The parliament has a lot of capacities, and their impact assessments are very good, and I'm very grateful to the parliament when it comes to my portfolio. So I believe that sensibility and sound minds will prevail after the elections. Well, I recently heard an interview with the current MEP, Mr. Guoga, about pensions. Well, his proposals are quite good, but I don't see him very often in the parliament. But his proposal is simply fantastical. You can wonder on what side of the moon he's living. Well, we're approaching the end of our discussions, and I believe that the next question would be best suited for transport commissioners, but I will ask that question to you. So what do you think about the development of the hyperloop technologies? Is it a reality? Is it a threat to other transport modes, for example, railways? So, Mr. Doppelbauer.
Well, hyperloop has for me two aspects. On the one hand, we need to encourage innovation, and we need to encourage people who have ideas. At the same time, we also need to make sure that those ideas are channeled in the right direction. Now, we are in no position to demonstrate whether Hyperloop is feasible or not. It's for the promoters of Hyperloop who have to demonstrate that it is feasible and that it can solve transport issues. I personally have not yet been convinced that there is any realistic application of Hyperloop. By the way, I had a meeting with Hyperloop about 10 days ago, so personally I am not convinced. But it's about the Hyperloop promoters to demonstrate the value of their technology.
Pone Andriukaiti, ar komentuosit, ar tiesiog kaip paskutinį klausimą?
Mr. Andriukaitis, are you going to comment on that, or will you respond to another question which is most really related to your area of competence? Why do you think Lithuania has not become a country of medical tourism? Well, I don't actually agree with this question. To some extent, Lithuania is a country of medical tourism. Let's have a look at Druskininkai, Palanga and Birštonas resorts, because over there medical services are provided there, and the surgeries are also possible as an object of medical tourism. And of course you have to understand medical tourism in a wide sense, both the rehabilitation and surgical interventions and prophylaxis and other areas. Lithuania can develop many medical professionals because we have 2 universities, colleges, we have nurses and carers and other professionals that we can prepare. We have to make an attempt to develop that. Of course, some people want to develop only a certain segment of medical tourism. If we take a specialized area, maybe this is not enough developed. But of course, I am in favor of developing this area. Does anybody else have a burning question? If not, I would like to summarize. Both speakers encourage you to elect those MEPs who could help you elect the people who would help implement what you want. So I actually would like to encourage you to come and vote. And I hope that everybody who has listened to us and who have come here will be active during the election. And thank you for both listening and asking. Mr. Andriukaitis wants to say something. If you don't vote, others will vote. And you may be aware that 25% of the UK nationals did not participate in the referendum, and 75% participated in the event, and 37% of those 75 voted for Brexit. And now the 25% are regretting their non-participation. So don't make this mistake. What does the Commission think? Will there be a second referendum? At the moment, we have a very clear message. The EU has said it plainly. And the UK has to make a decision itself. The scenarios, we have 2 scenarios. No deal, and if they don't ratify, but if they ratify, they will have the document in their own hands. And if they can't do anything else, we have to wait for another couple of weeks. Thank you very much. And we would like to ask you to thank the Executive Director of the European Railway Agency, Josef Doppelbauer, and Vyteniu Andriukaičiu, the Commissioner responsible for health, safety and health and food safety. Thank you.